So here's the book I wrote, UFOs Over Colorado. I dug real deep into various UFO organizations, contacted a bunch of UFO researchers, got some original cases of my own, and let's just start digging into what I think are the top 20 Colorado cases. So now we get to the number one case, which I chose, the Salida sightings of August 27, 1995. And this occurred in the town of Salida, Colorado, beautiful place. And that morning, August 27th, 1995, Brandy Edwards, who was 6 years old, Tim Edwards' daughter, was standing next to her father, who was the owner of a cafe in Salida. And she kept telling her dad, look, there's something in the sky. And he ignored her. He was working, but she kept insisting to look up. And finally, he did. He looked up and was absolutely shocked. There was a huge, gigantic, silver-colored, cigar-shaped craft. And Tim Edwards was utterly shocked at what he was seeing. As he said, this instant he saw this, and I quote, "They put some feelings in me I have never had before. When I was looking at the main craft, I got like an electrical impulse through my body. It was very important for the world to know the truth. Now I'm convinced we're not alone." So I think that this craft came down purposefully in sort of, again, a publicity stunt. And we're doing, have an agenda to make themselves known. And we're using Tim Edwards as sort of a vehicle for this. Tim Edwards grabbed his video camera and recorded almost 10 minutes of videotape while he, his wife, and his daughter watched this object. And to Tim, it appeared to be a very large cylindrical shaped object glowing with a pulsating light, which is really exactly what this footage shows. However, his wife and his daughter were watching it through binoculars, and they not only saw this craft, which they described as being more disc-shaped with colored lights, they saw other smaller craft darting around it. So this really affected Tim Edwards profoundly. He says, "I felt deeply at the time that I was witnessing something of great scientific and historic importance to the world. I believe that the August 27th craft was sending a message to the world and wanted to be photographed, that its appearance was somehow just the beginning of more to come, and that I was really fortunate to be a part of it." So he released his footage to the media, and of course it caused a huge explosion of interest. Newspaper journalists from across the world converged to interview him. And his footage appeared on a number of news stations and on television programs such as Encounters and Sightings. And for Tim Edwards, the impact couldn't have been greater. As he says, for the first 3 weeks, I was an emotional wreck. Everything seemed so trivial. My family couldn't understand my obsession with it. It wasn't long after this that he got confirmation from a number of other people who were seeing UFOs at the time. Many other people who actually had seen this thing. In fact, there was observers at Fisk Planetarium. They received a bunch of calls from people in this area who had seen UFOs. What is also very interesting is that this footage was researched by a number of photographic experts who specialize in UFO footage, such as Jim Diletteso. And Diletteso was not able to identify this as anything that he could make sense of, and declared that it was, in fact, unidentified. And he is not the only researcher who looked at this footage in detail. Also, Bruce Maccabee, very well known for analyzing UFO photos. According to Jim Diletteso, he says, and I quote, "It is definitely a very large, solid, three-dimensional, possibly cylindrical object at high altitude. We don't know how large it is as of yet, but the object clearly is emitting brilliant white and yellow colored lights and is demonstrating unusually rapid darting movements in the sky. And we have confirmed on the tape the presence of smaller objects coming from it, which confirms the witnesses' visual accounts. So further analysis confirmed that this object was hovering at about 60,000 feet and moving at times in excess of 10,000 miles per hour. So this turned out to be a really landmark case, and is probably among the best UFO footage to date that we've received. It has never been debunked, and no evidence of a hoax, and is, I think, probably the best footage coming out of Colorado. So that's why I gave it the #1 spot. It's certainly not the only UFO photographs coming out of Colorado. Here I'd like to share, towards the tail end of this presentation, some other photographs that have come out of Colorado. This was taken on August 8th, 2003. I obviously cannot vouch for these particular photographs, as I don't believe they were analyzed, but they were reported to MUFON and appear to show very unusual objects. Here's a case which took over a graveyard, took place over a graveyard in Alt, Colorado. I find that interesting because I actually did a study of UFOs hovering over graveyards, which, like prisons, is a thing that actually attracts UFOs. No kidding. I mean, this is actually a thing. There are cases from J. Allen Hynek, from Raymond Fowler, from many leading UFO researchers in which UFOs hover over graveyards. And it seems to be true in this case, and the witnesses were actually able to capture a photograph as well as some unusual orbs. So yeah, there's been a number of really intriguing photographs taken. I love photographic evidence, but these days it's not as good as it used to be, unless the witness is actually willing to stand behind it, because UFO photographs are now very easy to fake with Photoshop and other, programs. But many objects have been photographed. Here's an interesting photograph which the witness took. He saw this weird device being extended from an object, and he took the photograph, at which point the objects quickly darted away. Here's another interesting photograph. The person was actually taking a picture of the sunset, did not see any UFO when they were taking the picture, and only upon developing the picture noticed this object, which has a clearly definite hard, looks like a metallic object with hard edges. Many photographs of UFOs do not seem to be visible to the naked eye when the photograph is being taken. So that's certainly true in this case. Here's another interesting UFO photograph taken over Greeley. And it's hard to see in the original photograph in the upper right corner, but there's a enlargement to the right here where you can see that this is clearly a sort of typical metallic flying saucer. So definitely there have been some very interesting photographs. And now I just want to mention a few other cases, since I have a couple of minutes left, about some cases that didn't make my top 20 list, but I really wanted to include them because they're so interesting. There was one case which occurred on April 7th, 1966. This was in Littleton, Colorado, when a group of teenagers were camping out at the park in Littleton, Colorado, when they heard strange noises overhead and ran out of this little cabin they were in and saw a humanoid standing on top, at which point it jumped off and disappeared. They were freaked out. They ran into their car. They saw a UFO. Their car engine failed, and they went at some point, the engine was sputtering and the headlights dimming, and they drove off and reported their sighting to the chief of police, John C. McIver, who's pictured here. And he was very impressed by the teenagers' testimony because they were very emotional about it and clearly not lying. I like this case because it was a multi-witness case involving a humanoid, which is somewhat rare. Another case I wanted to include, but just didn't make the list, was a case that occurred on June 8th, 2005, in which a MUFON field investigator, actually the Australian director for MUFON, Glennis McKay, was visiting friends in Golden, Colorado, when someone pointed out what they thought at first was a large bird hovering overhead, but then it came closer and started darting around, and at one point it became very clear to them that this was not a bird. It passed over a grove in ponderosa pines and then turned towards them. And at this point, it started flashing lights. As Glennis McKay said, this object was flashing a blue light, and on turning toward us was silver and round and appeared to be landing on a clear grass area between the trees across the valley. It then climbed up to eye level and started to fly towards us. So 5 people watched this object as it followed the contour of the hills, then turned, flew for a short distance, and took off at high speed towards Denver. One of the witnesses did snap 2 pictures, which I was not able to view. But as Glennis McKay says, and I quote, "This really made our trip to the USA a pretty exciting one, as our host and hostess had never seen a UFO or even believed in them up until this time." So a very interesting case for sure. And one final case I also like to talk about because it's just so bizarre and extensive, and I wish I had more information about it. This appeared in where I found it was in one of Timothy Good's excellent books. Timothy Good is one of my favorite researchers. I do know that this case was investigated by Dr. Leo Sprinkle and a number of other researchers. And this occurred at a Rocky Mountain ranch. I'm not sure where it is, but it's not too far, I believe, from Cheyenne Mountain Complex. And this was throughout the mid-1970s when the owner of the ranch started seeing UFOs, started having some of his cattle mutilated, started having Bigfoot sightings. This was ongoing. They had one instance where there's Bigfoot ran right across their property. UFOs were getting very close overhead. They had once some weird electromagnetic effects. Their stereo went on and actually talked in a voice, warning them to leave the matter alone. So it appears that the UFO is talking through the stereo, which sounds crazy, but I have to say that this is not unique. This happened to Whitley Strieber. This happens to a number of UFO witnesses I've talked to who have received unusual phone calls. A number of people have talked about messages coming through their radio. So this is definitely a thing. UFOs are known for affecting electromagnetic instruments. It's a very extensive case, and I don't want to get too into it, but it sort of all culminated in one encounter where the ranch owner was walking around his property and came upon a landed UFO. And at first he saw figures around him and thought they might be normal humans, but it became pretty clear that they weren't, because they looked very unusual, although human looking, were wearing jumpsuits and had large eyes and very pale skin, were very beautiful looking. And he proceeded to have a conversation with them. And what's really interesting is while he was talking to them, there was a Bigfoot standing right nearby and was being apparently controlled by these human-looking figures who basically told him that they won't bother him if he doesn't bother them. So it's a very interesting case, to say the least, and we'd certainly love to hear more about it. But that is basically my lecture for today. I really want to thank you guys for listening. There are many other cases I really wanted to talk about, but those are the top 20 that I feel are probably some of the most famous or unique or most credible or have something really important to contribute to our understanding of the UFO phenomena. And that's why I included them in this lecture.